Hello, class. I want to talk to you tonight about Prohibition. It was a piece of legislation that took effect in 1920, and the government was really trying to do the right thing. Alcoholism, heavy drinking was a big problem in the early 20th century, and uh, families suffered. Women and children in particularly. So men were drinking at a very high rate. You're talking the average American was drinking 88 gallons of alcohol per year. And there were spousal abuse, child abuse. Men were getting injured on the job, a lot of workplace injuries. And it was becoming a big problem. Now, there have been movements before in the 19th century. And you have to remember, before advancements in water treatment, beer was necessary. Wine was necessary. The water was not safe to drink. So it spirals out of control. And women are actually going to lead the initial push to see prohibition through. And so you're going to have a lot of women activists, and women were not welcomed in bars, as they called them, saloons, during this era. And men could get away from their families, their wife, and go to the saloon and not be bothered. So it was a sanctuary in some manner for men. And this just isn't married men. Single men went to the saloon. Sometimes your mail would come there. You could make connections. It was networking opportunities. And you might land a good job through your connections at your local saloon. So Carrie Nation is a woman who she really was active in trying to get prohibition passed. She was a little bit older, not a very big woman, and she would go into these saloons with a little hatchet, and she would, just destroy the place. And the authorities didn't really do much to her. And the reason why is they were afraid that it would bring more publicity, make more awareness of the situation. And they were right, because when she finally was arrested in Topeka, Kansas, it made national news. And it does gain some momentum for the prohibition people. So the terms I want you to think of, people that were for prohibition were called the dries. That means no beer, wine, alcohol, liquor, anything like that. That's dry. The wets are against prohibition. And the more reasonable people at the time met halfway. So they were talking, okay, let's get rid of the hard stuff. Let's allow beer and wine. Beer and wine are not as bad in the body. Wine, as we know today, red wine is actually pretty good for your heart. And so there's some movement being made. Now, the beer manufacturers never really took the dry seriously. They never took them seriously. And here's a situation: you should never underestimate your opponent. So the women are trying to push this through. Women don't have the right to vote yet. They don't have a lot of political connections. So they're struggling. And these women that were being abused by these drunken men, there's not opportunities for them. So they're They're really compromised. Fortunately for the Dries and the Prohibition movement, Wayne Wheeler gets involved. Wayne Wheeler was a very talented man, well organized, and he's going to put political pressure on local politicians, members of Congress, senators, and he's really going to take the Wets by surprise. Budweiser, Stroh's, all these beer manufacturers, they're not worried at all. But once Wayne Wheeler gets this train moving, and he's very well organized, he gets all these people to sign these petitions, and he's got all these potential voters who will vote you out, Mr. Politician, if you do not support the Dries. And Prohibition's actually going to pass. It becomes law in 1920. Coincidentally, the same year that women get the right to vote, 1920. And Prohibition changes everything. It changes the social structure of the United States. Women were not allowed in saloons. When Prohibition hits, people are still going to gather and drink. They call them blind pigs or speakeasies. And everything's going to change. Everything in the country is going to change in the 1920s due to Prohibition. Now, they did give people time before this law took effect. You would have a year to be able to stock up on your favorite bourbon, or you like Jack Daniels, Jim Beam, whatever you like, wine. Go ahead, stock up, and you'll be fine. You can drink at home. You can make beer, wine at home. You just can't drink it in public. It's not available in the stores, but they have these beer kits to tell you how to make beer. Now, a big problem is the cops don't want to enforce it. They don't want to enforce it. They think it's a silly law. They think it's an overreach by the government. And a lot of these police officers are drinking themselves. So they're not going to enforce this law very well. Another problem is Wayne Wheeler and the Dries, they pushed for too much. So when Prohibition first became the law, wine and beer were okay. But there's going to be more legislation passed wiping out wine and beer. So here in Detroit, Stroh's went to make an ice cream until Prohibition ended, when they would make both. Beer came back for a while. I believe Stroh's made beer maybe until 1999. They're only ice cream now. So the Wets got really ambitious. Now, people generally obey the law. So early during Prohibition, there wasn't a whole lot of lawbreakers. People tried to abide by the rules, and there was success. We see less domestic violence. We see less accidents at work. We see less child abuse. But in time, people wanted their drink, especially wine and beer. So there's some loopholes. If you go to the doctor, you can get a prescription. He can write you a script for beer or for wine. It can be used in church services. So in New York City, we have the number of rabbis, increase, just crazy increase. There's all kinds of priests everywhere now getting, what they need for their personal consumption. So bootleggers are going to come of age. Organized crime is going to be a problem in the United States. So you guys have probably heard of someone like Al Capone in Chicago, a mobster. Here in Detroit, the Purple Gang, mostly young Jewish boys They were very rough. They were the first to use machine guns. So Prohibition creates opportunities for organized crime to make a lot of money. So on the border of Canada, towns like Seattle, Detroit, Buffalo, you're going to see what we call rum runners. So the speakeasies are going to get their alcohol from Canada. It's going to come pouring in, and you have the rum runners, you have the purples in Detroit, you have all this organized crime. And again, the cops are not really active in enforcing this law. In Seattle, in fact, a former police lieutenant becomes the most prominent bootlegger in the area. And he had to resign from the police department, one, because he's breaking the law, and two, he was making so much more money as a bootlegger. And the government essentially didn't pursue bootleggers, organized crime a little bit. They pretty much didn't enforce the law. And it's going to be a problem. So there's going to be too much violence, and eventually the government is going to try and do a better job at enforcing the law. But it's going to be a long, long struggle. Now, Prohibition lasts for roughly 14 years. It's the law for 14 years. So we see a social dynamic change in the social aspect of drinking. So remember I said earlier, saloons were male only. Speakeasies welcome men and women. So you have a lot of young girls now going to these speakeasies, and this is the type of social situation we've had ever since. Women are absolutely welcome in bars. Prior to Prohibition, that was not the case. They were not welcomed. So the violence, all of these low-time hoodlums now are becoming super wealthy. And Prohibition, quite simply, is going to ultimately be a failure. It's ultimately going to be a failure. And under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Prohibition is going to be abolished. It's the first amendment ever that didn't stick. All our other amendments to the Constitution, they persevered. Prohibition is going to be the first one not to have a very long lifespan. Again, 14 years. Some people bemoaned that the law was against the poor. That 1 year where you could stock up. Poor people probably couldn't afford to go out and buy how many ever cases of whatever liquor they like. So there were some problems as far as a social economic dynamic. The president, in fact, President Harding, when he was in office, he had his favorite bootlegger come and supply their favorite drinks for their weekly meetings. So even a president is breaking this law. So it seemed to be doomed for failure. But I want you guys to remember the government was acting, I believe, in the best intentions. Wayne Wheeler and the Wets got a little bit greedy, and they tried to include wine and beer. And that's when you had this big pushback. The police enforcement was very weak until you got this organized crime where, the violence was so great that the government had to step in and act. Locally, Michigan had some of the most strict laws. If you violated Prohibition, they would come down pretty heavy on you. In Michigan, traditionally, you guys probably heard of White Boy Rick. Michigan traditionally has had strong laws against drug abusers. They strong reputation of being very tough on any any crimes that involve drugs in Michigan. So for your next quiz, I want you guys to write an essay on prohibition. It's going to be available Wednesday morning, so you guys can write your quiz on that. A very short essay, and you can use the readings, this brief discussion we've had here today, to write your essay. All right, until next time, goodbye.